So imagine in 1976, CBS is interviewing your father, okay? And they're calling him the most powerful man in the world, okay? Your father is a king at the time, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, okay? He has taken Iran from where it was before of 1% of the population spoke the language to 50%, revolutionized everything in Iran, and there was peace in the Middle East. The chaos we have in the Middle East today, that wasn't happening back then, but he's becoming more and more and more powerful. And then the fall comes and your father is kicked out of the country that he built. And you're sitting on as an 18, 19, 20-year-old boy, man, saying, what's going on here? Then your father dies. And then for 40 plus years, Iranians worldwide, every time they saw you, they're expecting you to bring back freedom to Iran. How would you handle all of that pressure if that was you? That's the person I spoke to today, the Crown Prince of Iran, Reza Pahlavi. We first met, I think, 8 years ago, 2015, 2014, and we had a 3-4 hour conversation in DC at a nice Italian restaurant. And from there on, we've been trying to do something about an interview. And this is the first time he's done a long form, 3 hours. Every question I ask, I have all these questions that we prepared hours for. I covered everything I wanted to ask him. I showed clips, some clips about his father when he did interviews with CBS, when he did interview with Wallace, and comments that Nixon made or Kennedy made, Reagan made or Carter made. And we talked about a lot of different things, the mistakes his father made. You know, what caused the fall? Was it the CIA? Was it MI6? Was it the oil deal where the contract was coming up and the, 4 powerful countries at the time were worried that this guy was going to raise the prices? Was it the Shah showing his hand because he was becoming too powerful? What was it? And what are his next moves? One thing that will happen if you're Iranian, specifically if you're Iranian, this is something you're going to want to watch from beginning to the end. Some of you are watching this right now because you saw a clip go viral on Twitter or TikTok or Facebook and you're finally seeing this clip, but some of you are going to watch it from beginning to the end. You're going to want to share this with anybody and everybody you know that's Iranian to watch it, specifically if you're like me and you would like to one day go to Iran and have your family see Iran. I got 4 kids. I'd like to one day them go to Iran and see their pop, their dad, me, growing up in a street called Khiyaban Hojat, and what that was like, because some of the things he and I talk about, you'll see one part gets very emotional, gets very intense. I challenged him a bit because I really wanted to get clear on a question to an answer of whether he really wants this job, because everybody's expecting him to go back to Iran and be the person and help out. And he addresses that. And this is the most transparent I've ever seen him in any interview. And I followed his story for a while because I lived in Iran for 10 years and I escaped. I was born 3 months before his father went into exile. When they kicked him out, I was born 3 months prior to that when my mom and dad were being escorted to the hospital because my mom's water broke and, security's out there at 10 o'clock. They were saying, what are you doing out there? I was like, listen, my wife's pregnant and I'm born after midnight on October 18, 1978. This is in my blood. This is where I was born, okay? I'm made in America, but I'm born in Iran. This is why this has been an interview I've been looking forward to for a long time. Yeah, you're going to see a lot of different things we talk about. And if you're a non-Iranian saying, why should I be interested in this topic? I'm not Iranian. I live in France. I live in New York. I live in LA. I live in Australia. Why should I care about this? Because the more chaotic Middle East is, the more of a price you pay for it because it could bleed into your area. Middle East is one bad decision away from a war starting. And I'm talking not a pretty war, because the next one's not going to be a pretty war. World War I, we lost 19 million. World War II, we lost 60 million. God knows how many we will lose in World War III. Our job is to prevent it. So the more peaceful the Middle East is, most likely, the more peace you will have in your community, because chaos seems to come from the Middle East. So before I forget, we translated this into Farsi as well, Persian. You can listen to this by going to the settings. If you're watching this on YouTube, not on Spotify, but if you're watching this on YouTube, click on the settings at the top, go to audio track, click Persian. You can listen to the whole thing in Farsi. Having said that, enjoy this interview. It's going to prompt a lot of questions. I encourage you to watch the whole thing from beginning to the end, and I want to hear your thoughts. At the end, I will be going through the comments, and you can message me on Twitter as well. Would love to hear your thoughts with this interview. Enjoy this 3-hour sit-down with Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi. Your father was right. He was doing the right things. He made Iran a better place. Unfortunately, The competitors noticed he was getting stronger, and he revealed his hand instead of maybe holding his hand. And that kind of pissed off the enemy.
I think mistakes were made on every front, including my own father.
Inflation right now is 45%. Interest rates 12%. Some will say there's a business model for the Middle East being chaotic.
At some point, it's got to give. What can happen after we eliminate this mafia-like regime that uses repression at home and aggression abroad? What they fear are the people, more than anything. What gives us the incentive is we deserve better than what we have right now. Iran should have been today the Japan of the Middle East. I mean what I say when we can move from hope to belief, because I believe all the ingredients for that exist, both internally and abroad.
Do you want the job? Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi. We've been looking forward to this for a long time. It's great to have you on the show.
Thank you so much, Patrick, for having me on your show. I was looking forward to it as well, so I'm very happy to have this opportunity to speak to you and to your audience.
Likewise, trust me, the pleasure is all mine. We've had a couple conversations. We met once in D.C., but this is an actual conversation, and the audience has been asking for it. They're saying, hey, you know, it'd be great for you guys to have a conversation. And to have this conversation, this is probably one of the most chaotic times we've had in a long time in the Middle East. I have a lot of notes of where I want to go with this. The audience we have, a part of the audience doesn't know the history of Iran, what your father, the Majesty Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the Shah, was doing back in the days, what happened to Iran then. So we'll talk a little bit about that time on how he improved the conditions, how Middle East wasn't chaotic. The relationship between Iran and Israel was actually a good relationship. The relationship between Iran and U.S. was a good relationship. We used to go to Iran, and, you know, celebrities would go there. They would go to, you know, concerts, all this stuff. So we'll talk about that. Then we'll talk about the fall. Then we'll talk about exile. Then we'll talk about coming out, you know, to the States, what that experience was like. And then obviously myself as a father of four, I would like to one day take my kids back to Iran so they can see their dad living in Khiyaman Hojat in Tehran, going to Gulbenkian, going to Bandar Pahlavi. I still call it Bandar Pahlavi. I know the name has changed. So we'll talk about some of that stuff. But the main outcome today is to speak to you about conditions and to see if there is any possibilities of Iran going through a transition. Some call it a regime change, some call it a transition. I want to start off with the survey here. A new online survey by Netherlands-based institute has found that over 60% of Iranians want regime change or transition from the Islamic Republic. Now, this is a Netherlands-based institute. This is not U.S., this is not your party, this is an institute doing it independently. The result of the survey showed that 88% of the population favor a democratic political system, which they don't have today, while 67% of the population are against having a system governed by religious war, which is what they have today. Only 28% favored a religious governing system. That's less than a third. Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, your father, the Majesty, was viewed positively by 64% of respondents, while 28% judged him negatively. 28% of respondents had a positive view of Ruhollah Khomeini, the founder of the Islamic Revolution, while 64% evaluated him negatively. When you read these numbers today, there's been many instances over the last 44 years that there's been an attempt to create a regime change to bring back democracy, and it's failed. What's different about today?
I think the most important element for everyone to understand is, first and foremost, the process that the Iranian nation, at least let's say over the last century, were able to experiment with. At the start of the 20th century, Iran had a constitutional revolution. We were therefore the first country to move away from an absolute system of governance to a parliamentary system. And that was, in its days and time, quite a leap forward. But what further brought our country out of being underdeveloped or during the Qajar period really way behind was the advent of modernity and secularism, which was really what my grandfather brought into the country in the early 20s. And that was the game changer for a society that was extremely traditional, very much religious-based. There were no modern institution of any kind, whether it was the police or the post office or the army or what have you. And later on, at the time that my father took over, right towards the end of the Second World War, and by bringing, I think, at the time, something that was quite visionary through the White Revolution, everything that led to the emancipation of women, the right to vote and participate, equalities, the economic opportunities, in many ways, quite socialist viewpoints, like making, for instance, factory workers having stakes in the profits that the factories would have. Nowhere in even the socialist world we saw that. These were quite unique when you come to think of other countries in comparison to Iran as far as the region was concerned. But what was also very important was not what we were doing domestically, but also in order to achieve all of this development, we had to have stability. So therefore, it was important for us to have good neighborly relationship with our immediate neighbors, with the Arab countries in the Persian Gulf area, with other neighbors, including the Soviet Union, mind you, at the time of the Cold War. And I think Iran had a very balanced foreign policy when it came to our relationship with China, with Europe, with the United States. Obviously, because of the fact that for all those who are old enough to remember what the climate was during the Cold War, we had no choice but to have a look towards the West that was free market economy, which was free as opposed to the communist world. And that pretty much explained the reason why we were much more in line or in sort of bilateral or multilateral relations with the European countries and mostly the Western countries than we would be with the other bloc, but that didn't mean that we didn't have any relationship there. So all of that, I think, is a process whereby Iranians for decades benefited from those aspects of newly developing countries in the direction of progress, modernity, technology, education, and what have you. In that sense, we had a stronger polity. We had a strengthening of our civil society, which of course is a component that, besides the structure of governance for any country, is extremely important. And of course, we reached a stage where there was a political crisis, which I'm sure we're going to discuss further. But the bottom line is that when you look at Iran today, and since the questions in the polling indicates of why is it that now people say, hey, we had enough of this term of governance. And the question, therefore, is, are Iranians prepared to have a democratic future? The answer is an absolute yes. And the reason I'm saying this is because when I hear the Gen Z of Iran today, when I hear the generation of Mahsa Amini and where they stand today, having heard from their parents who remember what Iran was like before the revolution, they experience, at least 2 or 3 generations of them, how many chances the regime had to reform, if indeed it was reformable, but came to the conclusion that it is not reformable. And therefore, the ultimate conclusion that the only way out is to go beyond this regime, that as long as this regime is in place, we cannot attain any of those ideals or opportunities or what have you. And so it's not surprising to hear these statistics. I would even argue it's perhaps even more than that, but let's say we take the lesser value. It still is quite overwhelming.
It's a big number. It's not a small number.
Yeah.
And you were talking about how things were in Iran. For the average person who doesn't know, when they go to school and they read the word, the Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the dictator, the oppressor, he took money for that. That's what they're being taught in most liberal institutes, and we know what that condition's like in the States here. But I want to kind of read a couple stats, if that's okay with you, on what happened during that time. During your father's 37-year rule, he spent billions of dollars on industry, education, health, and armed forces, and enjoyed economic growth rates exceeding the U.S., Britain, and France. These are the 3 empires at the time that everybody was looking at. National income rose 423 times during his 37 years. That's 423 times, something we've never seen before anywhere else. He made Iran the world's fifth strongest military. The world's fifth strongest military. And sometimes they're like, well, yeah, but he was not, for religions, and he was not good with Muslims building mosques. He helped build 3,700 mosques when he was there, so it's not like he was preventing people from doing that. Some call it a mistake. Some say he was being naive, but to him, he was about freedom of religion. Hey, you believe in that? Go for it, do your thing. Women could vote, and it's very important to say why that's important, because the gentleman that took over, Ayatollah Khomeini, he was saying in his sermons that the fate of Iran should never be allowed to be decided by women. He didn't look at women as making decisions on the fate of Iran. He improved literacy rate from 1% to 50% in a little over a decade. Numerous assassinations attempts on him multiple times took place. CBS in 1975 called your father the most powerful man on earth. The most powerful man on earth at the time. Now, there was peace in the Middle East. People were getting along. People were having good relationships together. It wasn't fantastic, but it wasn't what we have today. When you go back, because you lived there for 18 years. It's not like you don't have memories. I lived in Iran. I'm in October 1878, baby. So I'm peak of the revolution. I think in August of 78, you came to the States for flight school, or you were doing something. You were flying the Northrop plane, and all these different things, because you were a pilot. First time you flew a plane, you were 11 years old, and there's clips of it. We'll look at that. But when you go back with memories, I'm going to go back memories. I remember going to the palace that you and your family lived in. I remember going there and seeing all the pictures of your father put upside down. And it was, till today, it's disturbing to me when I see pictures upside down. If I go into a room and I see anything put upside down, I correct it. It's because of my experience when I took the tour. And it was an interesting experience for me as an 8-year-old, 9-year-old going through it. But you lived till 18 years old. What was beautiful about Iran? What's the memories you have of the Iran in the 60s and 70s?
For me, outside the aesthetics and nature, I'm a very nature-oriented person. I have big interest in environment, and in fact, anything that has to do with protecting our environment. Because I think in the future, one of the key industries Iran can have is tourism. And if you don't have a conducive environment to attract people, it will be something of a shame. And I think many of my compatriots are very much concerned about everything that we are facing today, including the water crisis and everything else that we need to pay careful attention to. But having said that, I remember all these trips that I took in various parts of the country and how much I enjoyed it. But most importantly was the human interaction. Now, I understand that, of course, people will assume that because I was a crown prince, it will be extremely ceremonial or sort of like staged, or it will be sort of official. But to the contrary, most of my experience outside of whenever I had to perform an official duty was very much incognito. I would travel in a very casual way with a couple of people accompanying me, with the security people discreetly following from a distance. There were instances that people would not immediately recognize me. And I tell you as an anecdote, I remember one time we were in an elevator coming down in one of the hotels in Tehran, and I was together with my governess at the time and my adjutant who was with me. I was maybe 7 or 8 years old, something like that. And the guy turns around and tells the gentleman who was accompanying me, your son looks so much like the crown prince. They wouldn't believe that I could possibly be in such
elevator,
or going to, let's say, the bazaar to purchase something, and at first people won't recognize me, but then there would be a whole crowd gathering and all those things. But to me, the experience was so natural with people when I would talk to a villager, or if I would interact, let's say, with a fisherman on a barge in the Persian Gulf, with a bunch of them trying to do their fishing. And I was very interested to hang out with them, so to speak, literally hang out with them in a very casual manner. And other instances where I would play soccer with local kids, in a military base in Ahvaz or somewhere else. And so it was not at all something that people would say, well, how would he know or be in touch? Those were the practical experiences that I had. And this was all during my teen ages, where I was older, and therefore, it's a different thing when you're 6 or 7 or 9 years old. But when you're 12, 13, 14, 15, it's a different experience.
Yes.
And so I had the benefit of being able to at least go. I didn't travel to all parts of the country, so I knew some of it, some of them that I would hope to one day see for the first time because I've never been there. But all of that is the collective memory that I have. And most of it, as I just told you, is not so much what I did in my official capacity, but most what I did in an unofficial capacity, which is quite different one from the other.
What's your fondest memory? When you go back, what's your fondest memory? Rob, can you pull up that clip? Your mom has a YouTube channel, and she likes to brag about her kids, right? Okay. And this video here, I was watching a couple days ago. If you just want to play this, this is you when you were younger. And the family together, you know, your father. How often you watch this yourself?
Oh, you know, there are so many of my compatriots who constantly send me clips. You know, I have a couple of Instagram accounts, and an official one and a couple of unofficial ones. So they send me clips and footages. And it's funny that I get so much more clips about our family that I would search myself. I mean, they keep sending me material like that, very nostalgic in some way. But it shows that, and you know what's interesting? You would assume that, well, most of these clips are people identify with it who are probably my age or older. But today you'll be amazed how many members of the younger generation actually relate to these scenes, albeit that they never lived that era, they only heard it through their parents. And, you know, I'm very touched when they keep calling me father, almost like a father figure. And they're related in that sense. And, you know, when I see myself 2 years old and now they call me that, it's interesting, you know, as you go in time, how generations to generations have a different outtake. You know, there's the generation of my parents and older who have a different kind of reverence, but I think it's mostly because of the institution. But there are a lot of people today who don't know any of that and are much more relaxed about it, but look at it much more of how they relate to the individual, and that to me is quite valuable.
Is that you?
Yeah, that's probably when we were in the palace in Tehran. We had not yet moved to either Saadabad or Niavaran, which was not even constructed there. This was, I think, they called it Kakh Shahr, or
Kakh Shahr.
Kakh Shahr means the city palace.
Does it get you, like, for example, for me, when I think about things that drive me, because to do something that most would say it's impossible, a lot of people would say it's impossible to create a regime change today. Iran has a 25-year, $400 billion contract now with China. They're backed up by them. Russia's there defending Iran as well because China and Russia are partners. You got Turkey, who's got one of the strongest militaries. They have the strongest military in the Middle East, but they got one of the strongest in the world. There's an alliance there where they're almost distancing themselves from NATO. You're almost seeing there's a division going on between the community and NATO. You got not necessarily BRICS because India's kind of playing neutral, but when you're wanting to do something this challenging, you almost have to tap into something that gets you emotional and gets you fired up to say, you know, I really want to do this. And the way you almost have to do it, at least for me, you have to go see old clips and see old conversations and see yourself back in the days and say, do you really want to be a voice and a leader in helping this become a reality? Do you find yourself when you go back and reflect and reminisce, getting emotional and kind of having the pride of wanting to do something about it?
Of course. And let me start by saying that there was a time where I didn't think that I would possibly see the fall of the Berlin Wall in my lifetime, and yet it happened. My point is, there are so many things that a lot of people may assume is like, we have to deal with it, it's a fact of life, and do not anticipate that at any moment things can change. And to me, the X factor has nothing to do with the powers around, it has to do with the people themselves. They are the X factor. And when I look at Iranians today, particularly it's important to understand that it's not like for the first time they're going to experience something. Many of the liberties that were lost due to this regime coming in power existed before the revolution. The freedom that our religious communities had, women had. We never had an issue of discrimination in the form that we see today. Whether you are a Jew or Baha'i or Christian or anything like that, we didn't even look at things in that context. I remember as a kid, you asked me what's one of the most remembering moment. That's the moment that Iran qualified for the first time for the World Cup. And I remember watching the game in Tehran in that stadium. There were 115,000 people in a 100,000 seated stadium, which was over capacity. And I remember we were playing Kuwait, and I think that was the game that was the one pre-qualifying for us. But there was a huge, huge consequence, and the energy and the atmosphere. But the reason I raise this is because I remember I had the privilege, bring the Crown Prince, to every now and then invite the national soccer team to play along with them, me and my fellow classmates in school. And we had, players of our national team playing with us, and they had a good time and we had fun. But the point that I'm raising is that in that national team, we had all sorts of Iranian ethnicities and religions represented. There were people from Khuzestan with a darker skin, people from the north with a much lighter, fairer skin. There were Armenians, there were Azeris, there were from Kurdistan, from Khuzestan, there were Muslims, there were Christians, there were, the point that I'm making is we looked at each other as fellow Iranians. There was never a question of who is the minority. And that's a climate that this regime created. All of this goes towards what I'm telling to you, what gives us the incentive. What gives us the incentive is we deserve better than what we have right now, particularly the fact that we know once where Iran was. Iran should have been today the Japan of the Middle East, not North Korea. We had all the potentials, and we still do.
Wow.
And when you look at the fact that Iranians are aware of the fact that we have these resources, my job today and my campaign is, in fact, to let them and move the needle from hope to belief. It's one thing to have hope. Everybody has a dream. But I believe that empowerment is key to success, the power of the people. But in order for people to be empowered, they have to have more than hope. They have to actually believe that it can be done. And I believe that it can be done. Irrespective of the fact of what you just cited, we understand, of course, what's at stake. I'm not saying it's easy. But if we believe in ourselves much more than we believe in what others can do to keep us from doing it, it's almost like throwing the white flag. We're not going to surrender because to us, when I say us, I mean Iranians today, self-determination, freedom, participation, human rights, all of that depends on us successfully getting rid of the evil that governing our country today. And our message to the rest of the world is when we share the same values of freedom, of democracy, of human rights, of equality, of putting an end to any form of discrimination, we are talking the same lingo. So we are your allies in principle. And so we believe and we expect that the Western world, way before it's a calculation of national security or economic interests, which, by the way, they will have with a regime that cares about its people, and it's inclined to go towards cooperation. I mean, how many democracies do you know that go to war against one another? And that's why I think that Iran, by bringing that factor in place, will automatically be an ally. But we need support. We need to be able to work the problem together. So I start by saying, first, we have to work on ourselves. First, we have to believe not that there is light at the end of the tunnel. Of course there is, but that we can actually do it. I've talked to many former dissidents of the Eastern Bloc countries, including Soviet dissidents. And they were saying at the time where, that's before Ronald Reagan or Margaret Thatcher were on the scene, sitting in some gulag in Siberia, pondering upon the fate of Mother Russia and what will happen to all of us, as dissidents. And one of them, I remember attending one of his lectures, was saying, the day we saw light at the end of the tunnel is the day Ronald Reagan called Russia an evil empire, which led ultimately to Mr. Gorbachev tear down that wall and so on and so forth, for those who have followed recent history. Meaning that there are certain external factors that come into play. And foreign policy of some key countries, of course, plays a big role. But that doesn't mean that all of the dissidents, whether they're in China or or they were at the time in Russia, or what led to an end of apartheid in South Africa, or the Solidarity movement in Poland, or many other examples that I can put on the table as people who felt empowered enough to launch their own campaign of liberalization. they had faith that they have to do it. Whether or not they're alone in it may be a different thing. We have to do it no matter what. That's why I always told my fellow compatriots, we cannot depend on anyone else but ourselves. But our message to them is our task will be far more easier if they come along for the ride, which is win-win at the end of the day.
And who wins ultimately, and we'll get into that, is the world wins because the temperatures are so high right now that everybody's worried what could happen if this thing escalates to the next level.
Exactly.
God forbid. But, you know, I want to talk about, you know, during that phase, what's happening. You're the son of a king. You're the grandson of one of the most respected and feared leaders in Iran, Reza Khan, the Majesty, who he was a whole different type of leader. When you drop his name, it's a different kind of respect you get from people that are older. You ask somebody younger right now, they don't really know what it is. They know about your father. But your grandfather was a, you know, superior general. He was a doer. He got things done and loved and hated at the same time. But I want to talk about your father and the events that led to the fall of Iran. I have my opinions of mistakes that were potentially made. I want to know what you think it was. And I'll make a list. I want to play a couple clips to you. A couple of the clips are in a book that I'm writing that I've been working on for 13 years. It's not coming out. It's something that I've worked on for many years. And he's in it. When I think about the fall of Iran, you know, you'll typically hear about the fact that CIA was involved, MI6 was involved. That's why they fell. Okay. Jimmy Carter came in. He did the toast. If you can pull up the picture when you're looking at the toast between the two, you know, you see this here. When I look at this, your dad looks very uncomfortable. And it's almost as if your dad is trying to be respectful, but doesn't trust an ounce of words coming out of Carter's mouth. But he's trying to be accommodating and respectful. And then Carter, at the same time, he's given a look of, you have no idea what I'm about to do to you when I leave this place. This is December 31st of 1977?
Correct.
And he leaves. And then next thing you know, the conditions get worse, and the rest is history. So CIA, MI6, the Shah. There's another documentary I watch about the 1954 oil consortium agreement that they had. That was a 25-year agreement that was coming to an end, and it was a way where originally it was an agreement they made in 1954, 50% of ownership to foreign companies. 40% of it was divided equally, 8% each. Among the 5 major American companies were British Petroleum, BP. They had 40% of it. Royal Dutch, Shell, they each had 14% of it. CFP, a French company, to receive 6% of it. And this was a very profitable venture because if Iran's grown the way they are during that 25-year from 1954 to 1979, nobody wants to give up that annuity. Nobody wants to give up that investment. There's some documentaries done about the fact that it was a meeting in Central or South America about what they can do for your father to fall. That's a different conversation that comes up. And then there's a couple other things, comments that he made, way before there was a President Trump calling out the fake news. Your father was the first one that called out fake news. You know, I don't know if you remember the interview. If you want to play this clip, I want to play this clip and kind of get your reaction of this. This is October 24th. 1976, I want to say, 60 Minutes. He's sitting with Mike Wallace, and you've seen this before, but I just want to get some commentary on this. Go ahead and play it, Rob.
Surely, Your Majesty, you're not telling me that the Jewish lobby in the United States pulls the strings of the presidency?
Not entirely, but I think even a little too much, even for Israel interests.
You think the Jewish lobby in the United States is too powerful for the interests of Israel?
I think so. Sometimes they are disserving the interests of Israel because they're pushing around too many people.
How do you mean pushing around?
Well, pressuring. They have many means at their disposal. They are putting up pressure on many, many people. And at the end, I don't think that it will even help Israel.
Why, if this is true, why would the President of the United States pay attention to that lobby?
They are strong.
Strong in what sense?
They are controlling many things.
Controlling what?
Newspapers, medias,
Your Majesty.
Banks, finances, and I'm going to stop there.
Well, now wait just a second. You really do believe that the Jewish community in the United States is that powerful? They make the media reflect their view of foreign policy?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
They do not report, we do not report honestly?
I love how he corrects here.
Don't mix things, please. I don't say the media. I say in the media they have people. Not the entire media. Some newspapers will only reflect their views, yes.
No?
This next part's important.
The New York Times, for instance, is owned by the Salzburger family, who are Jewish. Are you suggesting that the New York Times is biased in its treatment of the question of Zionism, Israel's existence, the United States' relationship with the Arab world?
I will have to put all the articles of the New York Times written on this subject and draw the conclusion. You can put this to the computer and it will answer you.
What you're saying is that, yes, you do believe.
Well, let's wait for the answer of the computer.
Washington Post?
The same.
The networks?
Less.
I must say you are speaking with your characteristic candor.
Pause right there. So when you're hearing that to today, CIA MI6, Jimmy Carter, 1954 oil consortium, him calling out mainstream media, and then I'll give you this last 20-second clip if you want to play this, Rob, when he's being interviewed on, not this one, the one where it's right there, the first 20 seconds, if you can play this.
Probably, and maybe more, because we are going to invest in the UK.
Have you been able to assure the British government that you'll be investing much of the money we pay you for your oil in British industry?
Sure, because I think that our
Right
country
here.
in the next 10 years will be what you are
The
today.
smile coming up. He can't hold it.
In the next 25 years, according to other people, I'm not saying that, will be among the 5 most prosperous countries of the world. When you
Pause it
become
right there.
something like that,
So to me, I am I enjoy sports post-game interview more than the game. I'm that guy. Like, I like to watch Michael Jordan's interview after the game. Great game you had. I want to know how you're going to answer the question. I want to know how LeBron answers the question, or Michael, or Brady, of all this stuff, right? I was born in this country. I lived there 10 years. CIA MI6, oil, Jimmy Carter, him calling out mainstream media, you don't mess with those guys, and him calling out the enemy in their eyes saying, we're about to pass you guys up, where his ambitions are being revealed. Were those any of the reasons for the fall of Iran?
It certainly is part of the reasons. And I think for most people who heard the rhetoric and the narrative of his arch enemies, that he was a puppet of the West or anything along those lines, this proves how much he cared and valued the interests of our country, to the point of risking his own throne, knowing that some will not take it the right way and may plot against him.
Very risky.
Well, but that proves his sense of national duty, and I think then history will be judged for that. But to be honest with it, look, there's so many components to what happened, and I think it would be too easy to focus on some aspects only. The biggest challenge that my father faced was, and let's not forget one thing, most of the oil revenue that Iran generated did not happen until the late 60s, early 70s, because we were still selling, if I'm not mistaken, a barrel of oil at around $1.80 to about $2.20, something around those lines. It was not until it came up to about $7 to $8 range that it created more revenue for us. Of course, OPEC was formed. We were sensitive to the fact that if we overprice it, then the value of raw material that we'll be importing to Iran will also increase comparably. So it had to be a reasonable price. My father always believed that the price of oil was not fair as it was earlier. So eventually we generated more revenue, which allowed us to commit to much more heavy loaded project in terms of modernization, in terms of industry, in terms of everything that was done in the country in terms of infrastructure, including, of course, building schools and universities and what have you, and all sorts of facilities. But the critics at the time, in terms of the liberal debate, of why was the political sphere limited? Part of it is because, and again, I need to remind the audience that we're talking about the Cold War era. many of the groups at the time who were critical of the regime were liberal in the sense that they wanted more political participation. But the actual groups that were waging literally war with the regime, including armed struggles, were Marxist groups that were aligned with Moscow. And Moscow's intention at the time was to find a way to somehow annex Iran, as they did in Czechoslovakia, as they did at the time. Iran never faltered.
Are you talking about the two-day group?
I'm talking about certain groups
Sure,
that were
right.
at
And
the
two-day
time
group,
there.
just so
and they aligned themselves with the Islamists, which led to this alliance that my father called the alliance of the red and black, which is red being the communists and black being the Islamists.
And to be fair, while on this topic, the spokesperson for Today Party pre your father used to be Mossadegh. That was one of the people that represented that community, the communists. Is that a fair statement?
Well, I think. Well, actually, most people forget that my father actually nominated Mossadegh to become the prime minister at the time because he believed he would be the best person to push the agenda for nationalization of oil for Iran. As a result of us nationalizing the oil, of course, the British were not happy about that, so our oil was boycotted, and all of a sudden that led to loss of revenue to the point that the Mossadegh government was becoming bankrupt. And it was not long before my father gave the farman to remove him from office, where the communists already had the Soviet flag floating inside Tehran on some, poles, flag poles, meaning that the danger was at the time that the country will fall into the hand of the Russians by means of the Today Party taking over. Those were the dynamics of the time. Now, if you took that into one sense and the argument for liberalization in terms of political participation, where is the balance? We didn't have at the time sufficient number of organized parties to create some level of balance. Most of the organized parties were these leftist or Marxist parties, including Today Party. So, and you pointed to the fact of how educated society was. Even today, people ask whether or not Iranians are ready to have true democratic, participation. I believe today, yes. But in realistic aspects, let's say the sphere for political openness was completely open. Who would have once, in a lopsided way, prevailed? Now, critics of my father's regime only focus on the fact that there was not political freedom in the sense that you had in the West. There was not. All other liberties was, but the political arena was restricted. But it was not just because he wanted so, because the circumstances was so. But he was still committed to reform. My point is that when we reached a stage where there was a political crisis in Iran, in 1978, a year preceding the revolution, there were many elements within Iran, some of them members of the National Front, who were urging that my father should take a step back from being directly involved in making the decision and become, not exceed the limit of a constitutional monarch and allow for him to, as they say, saltanat bokone na hukumat, which means he will reign and not rule. This was the whole argument then. But the climate went in the direction when the Islamists prevailed with the help of the Marxists, saying, no, we have to completely get rid of the Shah. And therefore, instead of seeking reform of the system, that in fact my father was willing to do that. I mean, this is all Monday morning quarterbacking, but these are the facts because, I've heard it both from this side of the aisle and the opponents of my parents over the past 40 years. And the fact was that there was an opportunity for reform, but it did not lead to that. Now, let's say if Gorbachev had happened 5 years earlier, maybe we would not be here right now. It would have been a different outcome. So to pin everything on foreign elements would not be really fair, but it's not untrue either. So that's one aspect. Some of it was domestic. I think mistakes were made on every front, including my own father. But the opposition, in my view, made more mistakes than he did because he was offering a possibility for reform. They didn't take that. They thought that actually, by bringing this cleric in charge, everything would change for the better. And as a result, by the time people found out what happened, it was too late. And since then, we've been faced with this regime. My point is, what is the lesson in all this? The lesson in all this is my father at the time, I'm sorry, I forgot one more aspect, which is also important. Right after that clip that you showed me.
Which one?
The one with Carter being in Tehran and talking about all that. Well, the undercurrent was beginning to shape. And some of these governments, including the French government, who hosted Khomeini as a political refugee, which, by the way, under French law, if given that status of asylum, you are forbidden from conducting any kind of campaign against another government, which was what was assumed. But the French asked my father at the time, after he moved from Iraq to Paris and went to that location called Neuf-le-Château, which everybody remember, he was not in any form or shape continuing his campaign. And my father assumed that the French would obviously, in exchange for allowing him to go there, in fact, many before that were suggesting, should we get rid of him? And my father was not at all in agreement of making Khomeini a martyr. I'm telling you this because these are not the facts in history that most people have heard, because media didn't talk about it, the revolutionaries didn't talk about it, because these are the facts that happened at the time. My father refused, besides the behest of many of the governments, including the Carter administration, to stand firm. He said, I'm not going to turn my arms against my own people after 37 years of reign. I'm not going to stain my hands with the blood of my own people. And he left voluntarily. When they found out, by they I mean Carter and company, the Guadeloupe summit took place, the summit, where himself, Callahan, which was the British foreign minister, Helmut Schmidt, who I think at the time was the German chancellor, and the French president Giscard d'Estaing, they all decided, well, if we cannot rely on the Shah to maintain his power, we have no choice but to support Khomeini.
Did they want the fall? Did they want the fall because they knew the leverage and negotiation was all on your father's hands, because he was about to spike the prices of oil, where they had to go through him, and it was going to make you even a more powerful regime? Was it more that being their fear that they influenced the fall?
Well, I mean, remember that I think, if I'm not mistaken, at the time we were selling a barrel of oil at about $14 to $15, if I'm not mistaken. 3 months after the fall of my father, the price of oil spiked all the way up to about $35. The North Sea oil was not cost effective under $17 a barrel. So I don't know what calculation was into play. Was it only a fear that price of oil will go higher? Well, it did higher as a result of the revolution.
No, I'm with you. I agree, because you at least have somebody that you can deal with. The new regime you have no relationship with. Do you think they're going to sit there and negotiate with you? They're going to do whatever they can to...
Look, nobody knew who this character is. Everybody thought that Khomeini is some kind of a religious guru, the nice old wise man who will go back to Rome and play his role. I mean, people like Andrew Yang call him a saint.
Andrew Yang, the guy that ran for office, UBI, the Democrat.
Yeah, it was the mayor in Atlanta, if I'm not mistaken, at the time, I think.
Andrew Young. I got you. Andrew Young called him a saint, yes.
And others really believed that he really is that clerical figure who could possibly be that. And he turned out to be...
far from a saint.
Far from a saint, because he brought in this ideology. Well, the rest is history, as we say. But we need to address these issues, because I think if our audience doesn't understand the complexity of what's at play in that region and the dynamics of it, and why Iran is so different than the other countries in the region, because our sense of identity with our national identity, as opposed to the prevailing religion, which is not the priority, makes us say always we are first Iranian, then we are, let's say, of this ethnic tendency or that religion. That's very important to understand. What do we relate to in terms of our national identity?
There's a part also for me that I wonder, a mistake that maybe your father was making. And by the way, listen, these are quite frankly, more selfishly my own questions. The audience, like, you know, is probably going to get value from it because I'm curious about it, but it's more my own reason for asking these questions. Mm-hmm. I think the challenge every leader has, you're a father, I'm a father, you're a leader, I'm a leader. When you're a leader, you try to, there's a great book written, The 5 Temptations of a CEO. One of the one is you're trying to please everybody, okay? And I think there was an element of your father that was trying to please the poor, the socialist element, and he was trying to please the rich and the higher class, which is very hard to do. In 1963, the White Revolution, he redistributed land from the rich and he gave it to the poor, the 2.5 million people that got land. Imagine you're just like, hey, here's some land. What? He did that. Redistributed, that's a word of a socialist. That's something Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, AOC would use. We did that, right? And in 1967, October 16th, you know, the 2,500-year celebration of the Persian Empire, which you kind of watch it. There's a documentary done on that as well, on how unbelievable. Maybe there's never been a party like that, celebration in the last 100 years, where that many powerful people are coming to a party, and everyone wants to know who's going to get the best table, the seat. You know, they're going through it, right? Do you think there was also an element of him trying to win the rich and the poor, and ultimately he ended up partially losing both of them?
You know, in the context of social justice, you cannot have an imbalance between the rich and the poor. There's always that divide you have to try to reconcile. And to put the labor forces in Iran at work, you have to provide them with the incentives, with the protections. And as a result, if you make education free, if you make, I don't know, many other aspects of things free, you equalize the field for the people who have lesser means. And he tried to do that through some of the programs that was the result of the White Revolution, but also the way the system was going. At the same time, we had to encourage the private sector from investing in the country, which is why many of our top industries or factories were basically funded or brought in by Iranian entrepreneurs. Who had a huge impact in Iran's economy in the past. Many of them were non-Muslims. Many of them were families who were from different persuasions, which is why the minute the revolution happened, Khomeini started confiscating their goods. They were forced to flee. And the first brain drain that Iran faced at the time was right after the revolution, where most of these people had to leave the country, leaving all their properties and belongings behind. The country still functions as a result of all the efforts and investments of the period at the time. So it was, I think, if you come to think of it, addressing both those who could help build the country, and we needed them, and there were people who were affluent and were capable and had the means, but also at the same time allow for the country to become more and more educated so we can be more and more independent from others. Let's say, for instance, if you want to bring in a company and have a bunch of engineers trained so they ultimately replace whatever is, you know, transfer of technology. And at first you have to have your foreign so-called engineers and or operators, and you train the local people so they can take over that industry. You cannot do that if there's not a basis of education. So if you look at it, and the reason why even today we have many Iranians strong in mathematics or science, and they go to places like MIT and Harvard, and we had that kind of a training back then in the Iranian schools. That meant that a lot of these kids, and they were not from privileged families. Everybody had an opportunity to sign up, and if, of course, you passed the grades and the concours, as it was called within Iran, you would be almost guaranteed a job after you were...
Which is very important, because you say, hey, if you go get a degree, you're going to get a job. It's important to deliver on that promise.
And it was practically what was happening, as opposed to today, where despite the fact that these kids, God knows, after so much effort, managed to somehow get a degree, they don't have any opportunities for employment, irrespective of which class of society they come from.